Welcome everyone. I'm Tamara, Chair of the Poetry and Spoken Word Group of the Society of Authors, and I'm pleased to be introducing this afternoon's event, a panel discussion on activism in poetry. This event is part of the Society of Authors at Home Festival, a 12-week program of online events which runs until July. All sessions are free, but if you can afford to donate a few pounds to the Authors Emergency Fund to support authors in financial difficulty due to the health crisis, please visit our GoFundMe page, and I think a link is being put to that page on the chat. It's my pleasure to introduce Will Forrester, who will be chairing this session and introducing our panelists. Will is a writer and critic and is International Translation Manager at English Pen, where he runs Pen Translates, the UK's largest grant for literature and translation, and edits Pen Transmissions, an online magazine of international literature. Previously, he worked for Commonwealth Writers, the cultural agency for the Commonwealth, and in visual arts in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He project manages for Untold, a program working with writers in conflict and post-conflict areas with a current focus on Afghanistan, and is assistant editor at Review 31. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, The London Magazine, and elsewhere. Please welcome Will Forrester.
Thank you, Tammy, and hello to everyone tuning into this event. Thank you all for being here from wherever in the world you are joining us. As Tammy has said, my name is Will Forrester and I'm Translation and International Manager at English Pen, founding centre of a worldwide association of writers. I'm thrilled to be joined by three wonderful poets and, as you will discover, many other things beside, to discuss the not so insubstantial theme of activism in poetry. As I'm sure you'll agree, there is much terrain to cover in those two words. So I won't dwell any further than introducing the format of this event and also our panelists. So the first half of this session will take the form of a conversation, and I hope we'll also have time for a few readings as we go. And there will then be a chance to ask questions to the panel at the end. You'll see a chat box at the side of your screen, and please feel free to share your questions there, and I'll try to bring in as many as we can at the end. So to introduce the other people on your screens, I'm not sure if this is the order you're seeing everyone in, but below me is Khairani Barokka. Oka is an Indonesian writer, poet, and artist in London whose work has been presented. She is Modern Poetry and Translation's Inaugural Poet in Residence, and her books are Rope from Nine Arches and Indigenous Species from Tilted Axis. To her right is Clare Pollard. Clare was born in Bolton in 1978 and now lives in London. Her first collection of poetry, The Heavy Petting Zoo, was written while she was still at school and received an Eric Gregory Award in 2000. It was followed by Bedtime in 2002 and Look, Clare, Look in 2005, which was made a set text on the WJEC A-level syllabus. Her fourth collection, Changeling, was a Poetry Book Society recommendation, and her latest is Incarnation from Bloodaxe. Her pamphlet, The Lives of the Female Poets, is published by Bad Betty Press. And finally is Jacqueline Saphra. Jackie's collection, All My Mad Mothers from Nine Arches Press, was shortlisted for the 2017 T.S. Eliot Prize. In the same year, A Bargain with a Light, Poems After Lee Miller, was published by Hercules Editions. Dad, Remember You Are Dead was published by Nine Arches in September 2019, and Veritas, Poems After Artemisia Gentileschi, will be out from Hercules Editions in May 2020. Jackie, does that mean it is out now? Yes, so go and buy it, everyone. Jackie is a founder member also of Poets for the Planet, which I'm sure we will talk about, and she lives in London and teaches at the Poetry School. From those biographies, I'm sure you'll agree that there's little risk of us running out of things to discuss. So I'll get straight into it with a very large question for you all, if that's okay, by asking if you think poetry is an inherently activist art, or to put it as an age-old question, is it always political? Claire, I wonder if you could kick us off, please.
Well, those are actually quite different things, aren't they? I do think all poetry is political, in that I think all writing is political, whether it thinks it is or not. My latest book was actually a non-fiction book, a history of children's picture books. And even looking at like the picture books of Judith Kerr, they are political. You know, they say things like men go out to work while the woman stays at home, and it's okay to eat sausages, and robbers are bad. And, you know, it's actually, they are political. They're teaching, they're normalizing things, and they're making ethical statements, even a picture book, you know. So in that sense, I think all poetry is political. Who's speaking? What do they think's of value? What are they looking at? How are they framing it? Those are all political questions. Whether all poetry is inherently activist, though, I don't know. That's a very different thing. I'd like to hear what the others think about that.
Oka, I wonder if you could speak. Oka, I think your audio might be off. Okay, sorry, I think I still can't hear you. I'm not sure if anyone else can. Could we have a nod or a shake from Claire and Jackie? No.
Does anyone have any technical advice in those site?
I'm hoping there's someone from the SOA in the background who might be able to jump in and do something wonderful. Claire, I was going to ask you to read later, but seeing as you're the only one I can hear at the moment, I wonder if maybe we could just go to a reading of your poem now whilst we try and sort out the audio in the background. Is that all right?
Yeah, of course, that's fine. Okay, I'm just going to read a short...
Thanks. So, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'll just read a short poem from my latest full collection, which was Incarnation, which is about motherhood, but also, I suppose, about the politics of motherhood. And I was interested, again, as I say, very interested at the moment in the stories we tell our children and what we're teaching them when we tell them these stories. And I was interested in the story of Hamlin, which has always kind of haunted me, the story of the Pied Piper, that ending where the children disappear into the mountain, into the rocks, and it closes up after them. It's often framed as a kind of story that's about the sin of the adults, if you like, that they get punished for, is their failure to fulfill the capitalist deal. They get a service and they don't pay for the service. And that's kind of often how it's framed, as what the sin is. But I was interested in the thought, maybe actually the sin of the adults is hiring the Pied Piper in the first place, or is in wanting the rats dead in the first place, perhaps. So it's quite a political poem about a children's story, I suppose. Hamlin. This town, they ruin everything. Thieving, feasting in bins, their high shrieks, the shitty mess. They scuttle like fingers on a keyboard, plump, drain sleek, a whisper of breath, tip-tapping feet. Our high-pitched whistle has only driven them to darker places, to watch with twitching, clever faces, tails swishing like fingers on a screen, sharing and sharing something sickening. We must face the nature of the threat and extend the powers of the catcher. Think of ordinary families, the future. Your daughter upstairs in her bedroom where the pale light pours like water. When they're gone, even the mountains will open their mouths as if in song. I can hear clapping.
Wait, can you hear me now?
Yes, we have you, Oka.
Yes, hooray!
Yes, all I needed to do was leave and come back in. All right, sorry about that.
That's all right.
Beautiful.
Thanks for jumping in with the reading, Claire, and perhaps we can come back to that. Sorry, Jackie. I think we've lost Jackie as well.
Oh
so
no!
what I'm going to do is let the SOA sort that out as well. Claire, we'll come back to some of the points from that poem, but maybe Oka, now that we've got you, you could a little bit into that first question about.
Yeah, sorry for that tech issue. I'm not sure what was happening there, but thank you so much for that poem, Claire, and what you said earlier about, yes, even children's books are political, right? What these subliminal messages that we're teaching young kids. And that brings me to the fact that when I was very little, so Indonesia was under a dictatorship, under the Suharto dictatorship, right? And a bunch of fellow writers and I, including Inta Paramadita, we've written about how when we were about 9 years old, the state started traumatizing us basically through art and showing us all this really violent sexist propaganda. And I was very lucky that I had activist parents and they were able to teach me as much as one can to a 9-year-old, you know, like what you're going to learn in school is wrong. And that's not how history happened. And you need to understand that there are things you can say inside the house and there are things you can't say outside the house, because the people I was surrounded with, luckily, throughout my life were artists and writers who had to be in exile or who had been in prison. So I was always really kind of aware, and this is something for me and my therapist, of how, you know, expression is always has risk. And it's really special for me personally to be having this discussion with all of you in the month of May, because in May 1998, tens of thousands of students in Indonesia stormed government buildings and occupied them and demanded that the dictator Suharto step down. And you would think that, okay, with the dictator deposed, freedom of expression is great, but actually it's not. Indonesia is still a really colonial power. In places like West Papua, there's still a lot of so-called anti-communist sentiment. And I think the poem that Will was gesturing for me to read earlier during some of her talks, this one is called Tailings. And it's for Anonymous. So in a previous life, I was a journalist, and part of why I was like couldn't hack it emotionally. I was like, let me be a poet. So one of the things I did in my previous life was I went to West Papua, and we interviewed a torture survivor there, a young torture survivor. So they've given permission for their story to be shared. They probably didn't know I was going to make it into a poem. So this is for them, Tailings. Some things fade to metal now, don't they? Where is clean geological nutrient? Everything this crushing has been predicted. Have you ever gaped into the staring wound of a gold mine? Biggest in the world is in West Papua. Once I listened to a man there speak of torture against him, land of gold. I remember now he was half boy. A small room we recorded him in, and his voice came measured and low. I remember lying in the tall mountain grasses of Papua, where my people kill having seen kills, thus stripping their own karmic sinews. Stratified layers of mercuried rock, a bridge for dead rivers, small body, where my shame made the cardiac beat into an earth near past forgiveness, saying to it, bear us as long as you want. Hiss of soil, air thick as a bloodied mouth. Please, you get to decide. What I was saying for the tech issue was that to engage with the word activist, I think we need critical thinking always, and we need to look at context, which is really important because I think that people on different sides of an issue can both call themselves activists and do nowadays, right? So we have to really think critically about what are they doing? Why do they call themselves an activist? What is the action here? And I also want people to recognize that in this age of social media, there's so many activists I know in Indonesia who aren't on Twitter, who aren't on Facebook, you know, who don't call themselves activists. In fact, the majority of activists I know in Indonesia don't call themselves activists. And I think it's a privilege to be able to call yourself one without any sort of retribution. A poet that I'd wanted to talk about is Wiji Tukul. So he disappeared in February 1998, and he was, I think, only 24 at the time. And his daughter is a poet as well, Fitri Ngantiwani. On my Twitter, I posted a recent link to translations of Fitri Ngantiwani by Eliza Fitri Handayani. So Wiji Tukul his poetry was activism, is activism, right? And the fact of his disappearance and the disappearance of so many other poets, as you know, well, you know, at English Pen, a lot of poets are in prison or have disappeared like Wiji, or have been killed for their beliefs. I think their poetry is definitely activism, but I also want to be cautious in terms of really peeling back the layers of what activism means and what we're talking about. So.
Okay, but just before I move on to Jackie, you mentioned your shift from being a journalist to being a poet, and that this poem came out of that journalistic period. And I wonder if you could just speak quickly about that shift and the relationship to activism of those two disciplines, and what starting to work in poetry was able to do for your activist practice.
Yeah, I think honestly, it felt like a more honest expression of a lot of the traumas that we, as you know, people who are Indonesian have felt. And I think that the subtext and subtleties of poetry actually allow for a lot of subterfuge. There's a lot of metaphor and simile and analogy that I've used in my own work, where I actually have published as anonymous while I've been here in the UK for some things, but with poetry, I don't usually publish it as anonymous simply because I feel like I can hide more layers of dissidence in the lines.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think, as you've said, you know, at English Pen, that's certainly an experience, is the different forms of your creation and how it allows you to sort of speak differently in spaces where censorship are issues. Jackie, have we got you?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
You. That's great news.
Oh, all right, good.
I wonder if I want to turn shortly to talking about the climate emergency and poetry within that context. And Jackie, that's something I want to come to. But just before, I wonder if you could quickly also start with that large question about the nature of poetry and its relation to activism.
Well, I think I'm with Claire that I think that activism and, you know, whether a poem is activist, whether it's political, are probably two separate issues. But I'm also with her in the sense that I think that, you know, anything that a poet brings to a poem has a political edge to it. And I was thinking, as Claire was talking about Yeats's poem Leader and the Swan, which I've always found a really, really difficult poem to read and to listen to because it's a patriarchal attitude, because it is glorifying rape. And I wrote what I describe as I suppose an activist sonnet in response to that sonnet, because I felt it needed something. Someone needed to push back against that piece of the male canon that was so firmly focused on the idea that there was something beautiful about rape, you know. So I think, and I don't know how much people had thought about it as a political poem in that sense. I think they thought of it as a political poem in the sense of, you know, calling back Irish history, and politics, but how much from the point of view of gender, whether people had thought about it in that way. And so I really wanted to address that. So I think there's a lot of stuff in the canon that is very overtly political that we have just accepted as being wonderful because the poetry is great, but the question is what it's saying something that we really want to take on and accept? So I think there's a lot of history that we need to push back on.
Yeah, and maybe that. Sorry, carry on.
No, I was just going to say in response to Oka's point, I'm always very aware of how fortunate I am that I can say what I want to. And I've published a couple of poems on social media recently about our leadership, which have really been no holds barred. And as I've pushed them out there, I thought, if we end up in a totalitarian society, I will be one of the first writers to end up in prison, because I've been saying some pretty nasty things, but I'm very much aware of the privileged position I'm in to be able to speak in this way. Oh, sorry.
If I could just add to that a little bit,
Sure.
One thing that I really want to emphasize here is that we're all interconnected, and the dictatorship in Indonesia was backed by the US and the UK. So, I mean, like the traumas that me and my friends, 3 generations of people, of writers, of poets have had to struggle with, and the traumas that the state imposed on us, they were all supported by Western forces. So it's really, I feel really strongly about wanting to connect to these dots between poets who think they're not connected, but actually we are.
And I think that kind of practice of decolonizing through connection is something we'll come on to in a bit if we have a moment. But yeah, I mentioned the climate emergency, Jackie, and you talk about the canon. We've thankfully moved past the point where nature is a purely poetic resource, whereby invariably men go out into nature in a romantic way, solitarily, and they write about it. It becomes a sort of resource. And actually, ecology and poetry now is very much more about resistance and activism. Now, you co-founded Poets for the Planet, as I mentioned earlier, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that initiative and the role you see poetry playing in climate activism at the moment.
Oh gosh, that's such a big question, and where do I start with that? I suppose I think as an awareness raising thing, poetry is incredibly useful. It's a way of engaging people kind of very directly with something that is distilled and potent, and often very accessible. And after we set up Poets for the Planet and we ran this big poemathon event, it was sort of remarkable to see the range of poetry that was emerging, that was really trying to engage with people who might normally not listen to poetry. So all the range from I suppose what you might describe as slightly gnomic poetry, right through to spoken word that people can readily access. So I think there's that aspect, and there's the other aspect that what poets can do is they can imagine. So they can imagine a different world. They can envisage a way that things don't have to be the way that they are. They can project themselves into the future. And the great thing about poetry is it tends to be, although not always, short, to the point. So you can deliver a message fairly quickly and with great efficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe actually you could just turn to Claire quickly. And what in another life, you're editor at Modern Poetry and Translation, and you recently had there we go. This is what I'm going to talk about. You had this edition on extinction, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the process through which that came about, and how that relates to what Jackie's just been saying in terms of the role poetry can play.
Yeah, I mean the I'm not sure I'd honour myself by calling myself an activist. I don't really feel I'm one of those people who gets up every day and does the work in that sense. But one of the things I'm very lucky, it's my real privilege, is to be able to edit Modern Poetry and Translation, which has always been a political magazine since its founding, and always had at the heart of its editorial vision
Oh.
We've lost Claire. If she doesn't come back in a couple of seconds, I might have to come back again to that point. And in the interest of time, actually, because we are slightly running out, Jackie, I wonder if we could have your reading at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I did sort of suggest a few. I don't know whether we want something like quite militant or whether we want something a bit less.
Let's go to something militant, and then we can talk
Okay.
about the need for militancy and not.
Okay. So this is a poem I wrote on the day that. Oh. No, we've lost her again. Claire? I can't even see her now.
I think
okay, so
lost her.
I'll carry on. So I wrote this. I'm writing a sonnet a day during lockdown, and a lot of the time responding very directly and immediately to what's in the news. So this one is in response to Boris Johnson's announcement of the birth of his son on the 29th of April. This is sonnet 38. And there was, and I'm usually using some headlines from newspapers, so in this case, it is believed that the Prime Minister has 7 children. However, he has not officially confirmed the exact number, said the Independent. Any farm would welcome him, potent and exact with his ejaculate. A specimen who cares not what he spent in sperm or where it went, he'll mate with any willing hen he finds on heat. Comes on repeat, he's prone to populate whole dynasties with his tenacious seed, foul breeding stock, explosive, indiscreet. Today's tricky. Handily, he's on retreat, minding the chick, not the affairs of state. Tip-top excuse for missing the debate. In lieu of leader, we must contemplate this total cock who postures, struts and whines inside the hen house, ducking question time.
Thank you. That's incredibly pertinent. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that idea of militancy and the role that poetry plays in that, and why we need militant poems.
Well, I think that one was just born out of an absolutely incandescent rage. I mean, mostly to do with the fact that the Prime Minister had been absent long before his confinement with coronavirus, as well as during it, and a sense that there were all these little events like, well, I mean, it's a big event having a baby, right? But in the scale of what's going on, it was given up quite unnecessary airtime. And, his private life perhaps shouldn't be any of our business, but yeah, it seems to reflect so much about the man that he is. And so I think rage is a very powerful force, actually. And I think if we can channel it, which is what I've felt like I've managed to do in that poem through that like constant repeat of the same rhyme, the potent and the heat and the seed and the indiscreet. I felt that was really probably of all the 54 sonnets I've written since I started doing this lockdown sequence, that was the one that I really felt the rage. And I think there is something very powerful. I mean, advertising, people use it all the time, right? They use a rhyme, they use assonance, they use alliteration as a way of getting their message across. And I think there are times for being indirect, and there are times when you just need to come out and say the thing. And I'd like to feel that there's room for a whole spectrum of responses to what's going on at present. But I think that poetry has the ability to connect very immediately with events as they are happening. And if you think of Wassan Shire's poem, the one about refugees, and you don't leave home unless it's like the mouth of a shark, and the way that went viral, there's something about the image and the music of poetry that speaks to something deeper in people than prose.
Claire, I wonder if I could bring you in. Something that I've always loved about your poetry is that it speaks on many frequencies. There's a whole range of emotions there. There is a lot of anger at points, but there's also a lot of comfort at points. I think of, you wrote a wonderful poem, The Gift, for the Trafalgar Square Christmas tree last year. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the point on militancy that Jackie's been making, but also the need for hope, because perhaps that's something we don't talk about enough when we talk about activism.
I mean, we hope Rebecca Solnit writes very well about hope, doesn't she? That, you know, it's something you need in an emergency to smash the door in. It's not the idea that hope is this kind of twee, sweet thing, hope, the butterfly at the bottom of Pandora's box or something, but actually it's a necessary tool. I find that very convincing. I don't really, again, I was about to talk about this though, and I was just going to say, you know, in a way, I feel a bit uncomfortable talking about my poetry in the sense of activism, because right now I don't necessarily think that mine is a voice that people need to be hearing, especially in terms of this environmental emergency at the moment. I wrote a climate change play like 15 years ago. It was supposed to be the first in the UK, but, you know, nobody really listened particularly. I don't feel it did anything. And much more urgently at the moment, I feel, rather than, you know, privileged English people writing a classical English, you know, nature poem with a hint of fear in the backdrop, we should be actually listening to people around the world who are facing climate disaster right now, and who are editing their cultures to survive right now. And you know, more than ever, we have the technology and stuff to actually listen to voices from around the world and to amplify and provide a platform to those people. And I think that's what I feel is the most important thing I can do in my privileged position at the moment.
That's great, and I'm going to bring Oka in a second to talk about these ideas of representation and access and who gets to speak, because that's something we've spoken about before. I'll say we are sort of racing through the time. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but I just want, for everyone who's listening, do you feel free to start putting your own in the chat panel to the right, and in about 5 minutes or so I'll try and bring them in. But Oka, yes, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that idea of who gets to speak in two ways, really. One, in terms of and the other in terms of access and accessibility, and what poetry is doing in terms of fighting ableism, but also what more it needs to do in its own practice.
Right. So I don't separate those two, actually, in my work. I think that anti-ableism is anti-colonialism, if you really get down to it. And that's something that I'm trying to tie through all of my work, particularly as a disabled poet. So, for instance, in Javanese culture, I'm half Javanese, before the Dutch medicine came in and hospitals were built connected to churches, I mean, we still have disabled gods, right? But there became this ableism, came along with colonialism, that was like, if you are not normative, if your body mind is not normative, then you need to be decimated. You need to be cured, you need to be cast out. So it's really sort of rediscovering my own heritages of, you know, there's so many indigenous traditions where, and Javanese cultures are the colonizers of Indonesia, you know, so that's a whole other thing. But there are so many indigenous cultures where there are different capacities for understanding body minds and languages. And in terms of poetry as activism, Stares and Whispers, Deaf and Disabled Poets Write Back, which I co-edited with Sandra Allen and Daniel Sluman. Yay, 9 arches. Thanks, Jane Kemain. That came out in 2017. And we very much wanted it to be an activist anthology. It was the very first anthology of its kind in the UK that was not by people who had disabled siblings or parents or kids, but by actual deaf and or disabled people. And we made it completely accessible in terms of there are links at the bottom of each page with, you know, SoundCloud links to the poets reading out work if they can read it out. And there are also BSL films. Those are all free on the 9 Arches page YouTube, by the way, if anybody would like to see those that are captioned. So I really want to ask people, you know, what does activist mean to you? Because I think activist is in the eye of the beholder. For instance, and so is the idea of militancy, and so is the idea of hope and anger. And I think militancy is a really political term because, you know, for Black and Brown people in Western countries, a lot of times we're marked as militant for simply wanting to gain our rights and respect and actually fight to be acknowledged. There are lots of times where I have tried to argue for my access to different things and people are like, wow, you're an activist. And I'm like, no, I just really want to make things easier for my life, please, you know? So I think there's always nuance in terms of not only which body minds or allowed to speak, but who's the audience for this, right? Because Indigenous peoples we've been speaking to each other. Like, why is it only, oh, now there's a microphone if it's for Western audiences, I mean? And I think that something that I really want to do further along is to continue to just connect Indigenous literatures and decolonizing as a form of anti-ableism and vice versa, because what forms of poetry are upheld are also deeply colonial. So with colonial laws came the written law, right, as sort of the main tool of power. And so many oral literature, so many oral languages, which is why the MPT issue is so important, right, are continuing to be extinct all the time. And English is a colonial language, like we're all participating in it right now. But there are forms that, for instance, pantun is an Indonesian form, right, and found in the archipelago, and that has so many social contexts. There are so many cultures where pantun, in English it's pantoum. Like at a wedding, you'll have pantun battles, against like each side of the bridal party, and that's really beautiful and cultural. But I had a friend in the UK say, "Oh, I didn't know pantun was Indonesian. I thought it was French." Because it has been completely stripped from its context, from its communal context, and its ability to build community. There are so many cultures that have been decimated like this, and so the reclamation of them is something that I find really beautiful, really important. I think language revitalization and poetry revitalization go hand in hand, and are really vital, and that also connects to climate change and environmental activism, because so much of, like Claire said, so much of nature poetry is written from this, Thoreau, Walden, white man alone in the woods, right? A perspective that doesn't talk about settler colonialism and how these are indigenous lands on what they call Turtle Island. And people think of this as, oh, I'm being at one with nature. There are so many nature reserves that were built on colonized land, that continue to be built on colonized land, right? Where natives have been cast out for conservation projects, quote unquote. And there's so many nuances in environmental movements that I think it's so important to have a multiplicity of voices from that.
And Oka, as you talk about all the ways these things, of course, intersect, and these forms of activism must intersect. Just my last question really for all of you is, as we turn that to the poetry world itself, and the structures and hierarchies and gatekeepers, to touch on that word, involved in the poetry landscape, what do we need to do in an intersectional way to reform the poetry landscape, particularly in the UK, but also more internationally, in order that we can address some of these points, more efficiently?
Are you asking?
I'm asking all of you, but Oka, maybe you could just come back to that one quickly straight away.
There are so many things that I can't even say here. I mean, even in terms of like having events online, this is something that disabled poets have been asking for decades.
Yeah.
And it's been so actually really heartbreaking for a lot of us that in a matter of days, because abled or non-disabled people might get sick, there's so many access features that were suddenly included in the literature scene, when that's something that a lot of us have been actually arguing for and asking for behind the scenes and up front. And I just want to acknowledge the people who came before us and who really, really wanted this and maybe couldn't have it. There's a lot. Stares and Whispers has a lot of tips, but that's why we need a multiplicity of voices, because one person in the world cannot know everything to do. I think we need to listen to more and more people.
And Claire, I could perhaps bring you in, as an editor as well. How do we do that? How do we represent the broadest perspective of voices in an intersectional way?
Well, what I've done under my editorship is just open the doors all the time. We're always open for, if anyone else is listening, we're always open to general submissions all the time. And we, that's quite frightening, because you could get sent anything from anywhere in the world. But once you start going through friend of a friend, or you're going through these sets of gatekeepers, you're not going to get the diversity of work, I don't think. So I think that's really important. And more you see presses shutting their doors and they have small windows. You have to pay all these, ways they're narrowing the gates in some sense. I think it's really important that as much as we can, we throw open the gates. And I just get sent some just amazing stuff from around the world. I would never have found it. It amazes me every time I look in my inbox that it's found its way to me,
No, it's an amazing moment, I think, when you issue an open call and that happens. I think it's very powerful. And Jackie, just before I turn to the audience questions, is there any one particular reform that you would like to see or sure many reforms that you'd like to see in the literature, in the poetry sector?
Well, I think we're a broad church. I think we should, there should be room for lots and lots of different ways of doing things. And I just wanted to add that with regard to the virtual meetings, that when we set up Poets for the Planet, we spent a long time talking about how we might have virtual meetings, exactly for the reasons that Oka was describing. And it seemed insurmountable at the time. We actually asked a couple of people to look into it who knew something about how to do these things. And nothing really came of it. And, it is actually to my deep shame that it has taken till now to be able to realize that we can have this democracy of access. I mean, assuming you've got your IT set up, but I'm already seeing changes in the audiences that we're having at these online events. So what I think we have to do is keep pushing for that, even when lots more live events are hopefully at some point available to us, that we can find ways of combining. Yeah, free broadband for all. Yeah. I
think that's something that lots of us literature organisations are, thinking through at this moment. Oka makes the wonderful point that things shouldn't have to happen to majorities and privileged people in order for changes to happen, but actually harnessing this moment and what it can do in terms of access, I think, is really vital. I'm going to just quickly turn. We may run a few minutes over. I've been told that's okay, and I hope everyone in the audience is happy with that. I'm going to turn to the questions. And I'm going to take one from Kate Noakes, which says, to what extent is activist poetry preaching to the choir? How can its reach be enhanced? Does anybody want to speak into that first?
Which poetry is activist poetry here? Who are you talking? I think it needs to be a lot more specific. What language?
I'd say that's often a problem with poetry, that it doesn't necessarily reach beyond, certainly poetry in this country doesn't reach beyond a very specific audience. So I think it often is preaching to the choir. But as Oka says, that that excludes an awful lot of what's in the world.
I think also there's, to maybe kind of offer a rejoinder to that, something I wanted to talk about is language. Your poets, your stock in trade is language, and the way we move across languages through translation and all its different forms. And perhaps that's a kind of way of focusing in this question. And I'm going to link it to another one, which says, I'm also interested in your take. I'm taking yours, all of you, on English, the English-speaking world. English enables wider access, but it also takes away from context. I wonder if you could all speak a little bit into that idea of translation and how important that is in the poetry world in the UK. And I'm sure, Claire, you'll have a lot to say on that. And Oka, I know you've spoken about that in the past too.
I think there's certainly an increased interest in translation at the moment, which I think is a really positive thing, and an increased interest in reading literatures. Again, I think it's partly to do with the internet. First of all, you notice a big boom in interest in American poetry, but now I feel like that's spread out, and there's more sense of people looking outside the UK mainstream and being genuinely interested in diversity. It's lovely to see the Derek Walcott Prize has just been launched, and there's a list that actually has books in translation alongside English language publications in a prestigious prize list, and that's, as far as I know, a first. I think that's a really a breakthrough, which I think is wonderful. Sorry, I've kind of lost my thread of thought. Okay.
So yes, I think that preaching to the choir, I think you're thinking of it in a negative sense, but actually for people who are continually beleaguered by discrimination, poetry is really life affirming, right? So I don't necessarily think that, oh, it's preaching to the choir. It's like, you need this positive energy to go somewhere, you know. I think it can be a really beautiful thing to continue like those kinds of energies. So don't necessarily knock preaching to the choir, because the choir can create beautiful things. And I think, and the choir can spread also. And I think that on having English as the common medium, English is still a very colonial language. It's something that I have a poem that I wrote. It's published in Asian American, the Asian American Writers Workshop online. It's called Money for Your English. And it's just about my continuous guilt, right? Having to, at somebody who has been bilingual and has been writing in English my whole life, but that's not my mother tongue, and the colonial baggage of that. But then also, you know, there are LGBTQIA plus activists in Indonesia who use English on Twitter, and they'll get backlash from people saying, why are you using English? But actually, as I said before, it can be a form of subterfuge, right? It can be a way of, it's like a hiding place. And I also find that in terms of anti-ableism as well. There are so many issues with translation that I'll probably talk on Twitter later and send links to articles I like by people about this. And Claire and I, obviously, you know, we talk about this as well. There's so many nuances to English and translation and the power dynamics and who, like, what an audience is and why things are being translated, right? Are things only valid because they're translated into English? No, right? Who is that for? But then also look at, you know, like, why does so much of the world know about Shakespeare and not many people know about Khairil Anwar, or, you know, an Indonesian poet, or Wiji Tukul, or, like, you know, so many, or Dorothea Rosa Herliani, or like any of these Indonesian poets who are amazing. I think that there's so much interesting work being done right now on the politics of translation, and yeah, that's a further conversation.
Yeah, and who's funding it often? Which countries are putting money into it? And then those countries, are they likely to be translating their queer poets or their female poets and so on? It's you've got to think, it's instead of just one gatekeeper, you've often get through a series of gatekeepers to be translated, and that's a very political process.
And I think, you know, as someone who's in a part of that kind of system of how things reach readers, translation particularly is burdened with gatekeepers in a way that Anglophone literature written in the Anglophone perhaps isn't. I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up, but Oka has mentioned talking on Twitter, and that's certainly something I'd be happy to do, and I'm sure all of us would, because I have more questions, I'm sure everyone listening does. You can find our handles, I think, through the SOA channel, so do go there if you want to carry on the conversation, and some of us will try and be around. So I'm just going to wrap up, and firstly to say thank you to Oka, Jackie and Claire for their time and some really wonderful points, and for readings as well. Thank you to all of the attendees. Thank you to the Society of Authors for hosting this. And I just want to close with a couple of bits of information. As Tammy mentioned, all the sessions as a part of the Society of Authors at Home Festival are free, but if you can afford to donate a few pounds to the Authors Emergency Fund to support authors in financial difficulty due to the health crisis, there is a link at the top of the chat there, and that's something that Society of Authors with English Pen and lots of other organisations have collaborated to work on. Coming up in this programme of events, tomorrow there is a session on how to sell your writing in interviews with Anna Craig. Wednesday is a session on funding and sustaining creativity with the Arts Council of Wales and Creative Scotland. And on Thursday, the afternoon tea is with Tracy Chevalier. And you can go to the Society of Authors website to book. There are still spaces. So I will let everyone get off, but just finally to say thank you all, and do stay safe and well, and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.